I couldn't watch an episode of Dungeon Meshi without listening to the opening first. That's because every episode was like a big piece of the dungeon. Oddly enough, the dungeon wasn't all that interesting. I mean, this isn't Made in Abyss, but at the same time, going through it with Laios and his party was what made this anime an absolute experience. The best way I can define Dungeon Meshi is that it feels like a fairy tale from a children's book. The art, the characters, the general aesthetic, all of it was so authentic. But that's just its appearance. What I feel really makes this anime different is that it's just this dreamy show that may lack profound detail, epic characters, or even a great story, but it makes up for all of it with charm. Dungeon Meshi is all charm, and this charm is best expressed with how Laios and his party make the dungeon come alive. I mean, I felt attached to every monster they fought because they weren't just an obstacle they put away. No, every monster was beaten with a unique approach that was always funny and endearing, like when they wore frog suits to get past the tentacle monster, or when Laios screamed at a basilisk to intimidate it. How refreshing was it that they never needed flashy moves or clever plots to win? If we went through the dungeon with Shiro, then it would have lost all its charm, because the dungeon in itself wasn't that interesting. It's Laios and his party that made it special. I mean, wasn't it boring watching Shiro and his party eat ordinary food from the surface? And the way Shiro took on monsters was effective, yeah, but also cold and rational. I much preferred watching Marcial using her familiars to fight the Griffin. Because of the unique approach every fight called for, every monster mattered. Every meal they made out of the monsters mattered. Something else that surprisingly blew my mind about Dungeon Meshi was Kabru. First time we see him, I'm thinking that this dude is your classic shonen protagonist. I actually caught myself thinking that he should be the protagonist, but then the moment he gets into the dungeon, he dies. The show built him up as this hero and then immediately killed him. This wasn't a coincidence, it was a message. And what the message said was that the dungeon isn't a place for shonen characters. It's a place for the weird and bizarre like Laios. You see, Laios is a sociopath. That's why he's so strange, but it's because of his strangeness that he has this unusual love for monsters, and that obsession is what gives him a perfect place within the dungeon's ecosystem. Remember that episode with Anne the Kelpie? Senshi was so attached to it, but Laios steps in with this crazy look in his eyes and tells Senshi that he can't trust monsters and they just ought to kill it and cook it up. At first, he seems like he's literally lost his mind, but then shortly after, Anne the Kelpie drags Senshi into the lake and tries to eat him. And right then and there, Laios seemed like this enlightened guy, which is odd because Senshi has been in the dungeon a lot longer. But you see, what makes Laios capable of making these seemingly inhuman decisions isn't simply because of his experience, but rather because he belongs to the dungeon, whereas Kabru, along with most of everyone in this world, belong to the surface. And you know, there isn't much more subtext written into the show beyond this point about the nature of the dungeon and who gets to survive it. Really, Dungeon Meshi is the first anime I've ever watched that lives off its charm and nothing else. Sure, it's unique, but there's shows like Princess Tutu and Ranking of Kings that have a similar feel to it. Dungeon Meshi, for the most part, thrives off of its charm and its charm alone, and that's actually super special.